Welcome to this explainer. Picture this. It's 1945. Europe is literally being torn apart by totalitarianism. And from his exile in New Zealand, philosopher Karl Popper decides to write what becomes one of the most sweeping, powerful defenses of liberal democracy we've ever seen: The Open Society and Its Enemies. This wasn't just an academic exercise for him. It was his personal intellectual contribution to the World War II effort. He really wanted to dig down and understand the deep, philosophical roots of the despots that were threatening the entire globe.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the strain of civilization. Popper identifies this really deep underlying psychological burden right at the core of human history.
Think about how exhausting it can be to constantly have to make your own choices, right? Well, Popper calls this profound, difficult transition, moving from a fixed tribal society where everyone just has an unquestioned place to an open democratic society. He calls this the strain of civilization. It demands immense personal responsibility. It demands constant critical thinking. And here's the kicker. Popper argues that totalitarian movements are basically just reactionary attempts to escape this exact strain. They're driven by this desperate, deep-seated desire to just return to the rigid, comfortable security of the past, to a time where, honestly, you just didn't have to think for yourself.
So how do these despotic forces actually justify this retreat from responsibility? Well, they rely on an intellectual weapon that Popper calls historicism. Now, historicism is basically the belief that history is governed by inexorable, unchangeable laws of development. It's the idea that history is on a set track, and it's used to predict and prescribe the future of humanity. The dangerous logic here is, if you can discover these laws, you can predict the future with absolute certainty. Popper aggressively pushes back on this. He argues that this concept is not just scientifically false, but it's politically disastrous, because it completely, and I mean completely, erases individual agency. Moving into Section 2, Plato's closed society, we're going to see how Popper traces the genealogy of this dangerous historicist idea all the way back to ancient Greece.
And he traces it directly to one of philosophy's absolute greatest minds, Plato. Now, Popper makes this bold argument that Plato, who was deeply traumatized by the rapid social decay he was seeing in Athens, essentially designed a deeply reactionary ideal state just to halt change entirely. We're talking about a rigidly enforced three-class hierarchy: guardians, auxiliaries, and producers. He advocated for state-controlled eugenics programs, which were conveniently disguised as a lottery to breed the best rulers, and an absolute monopoly on both violence and truth. Plato even pushed for what he called the noble lie, literally a myth told to citizens just to justify why they were permanently stuck in their specific social class. No mobility whatsoever.
And this really perfectly illustrates Popper's most controversial claim about the ancient philosopher. Look at the contrast here. Today, we view modern justice through the lens of equality, individual rights, protecting the weak, right? But Popper accuses Plato of basically hijacking the word justice to mean absolute inequality. For Plato, a just society was simply one where everyone kept to their class and absolutely did not interfere with the rulers. It was all about the preservation of class rule. Popper argues that this mindset laid the absolute groundwork for modern totalitarianism.
Jumping ahead to Section 3, Hegel and Marx's prophecies. Let's unpack Popper's really devastating critique of the modern heirs to this closed society tradition. Popper fiercely attacks Hegel, zeroing in on this one specific, incredibly bold quote: "The state is the divine idea as it exists on earth." I mean, wow. Popper accuses Hegel of literally deifying the state, basically making it a god. In Hegel's philosophy, the individual has absolutely no independent moral standing. Your only duty, your only purpose is to serve the state. Popper argues that this specific line of thinking provided the direct intellectual framework for the nationalism and fascism we saw erupting in the 20th century.
Next up, Popper turns his sights on Karl Marx. Now, it's worth noting that Popper actually praised Marx's genuine humanitarian intentions. He respected Marx's outrage at the brutal exploitation of workers, but he heavily criticized his methodology. You see, Marx believed in this inevitable sequence. First, the concentration of wealth in a few hands. Second, the increasing misery of the working class. And third, an inevitable proletarian revolution. Marx viewed this sequence not just as a theory, but as an absolute, deterministic, scientific law of history. He thought it was bound to happen no matter what.
And here is where Popper draws a really hard line between actual science and what Marx was doing. Real scientific predictions are conditional, they're testable, and most importantly, they are falsifiable. If the data proves you're wrong, you're wrong. But consider this. When working-class living standards in democracies actually started improving instead of getting worse, Marx's followers didn't abandon the theory. Nope, They just invented these highly creative, ad hoc excuses. Popper argues this effectively turned Marxism from a science into an unconditional, dogmatic, unfalsifiable, historicist prophecy.
All right, let's move to Section 4, Building the Open Society. Now that we understand Popper's critiques of these enemies, let's explore his positive framework for how we can actually build a better world.
So looking at this comparison, Popper is passionately championing the open society. In the closed society, you have this organic, rigid hierarchy. But the open society demands individualism and high social mobility. Epistemologically, instead of dogmatic, authority-based magical thinking, the open society relies on critical thinking, being critical and open to debate. And maybe most importantly, the view of the state completely flips. The state is never a god or an end in itself. It is simply a practical tool whose entire purpose is to protect individual rights and alleviate suffering.
To actually improve this open society, Popper introduces a really vital concept. He fiercely warns us against what he calls utopian social engineering. This is that dangerous urge to do a holistic redesign, to literally rip up society and rebuild it entirely from some grand blueprint. Because society is infinitely complex, these grand plans pretty much always fail, and then centralized powers inevitably resort to violence to force the plan through. Instead, Popper enthusiastically advocates for piecemeal social engineering. It's trial and error, it's decentralized. It focuses on mitigating concrete, observable suffering step by step. This way we can democratically spot and correct our mistakes as we go. He also introduces this idea of critical dualism to combat the historicist mindset. Basically, he insists we have to strictly separate natural laws from normative laws. Natural laws, like physical facts, they just exist. They're unalterable and they carry zero moral weight. Gravity doesn't have a moral compass, right? But normative laws, our human-made decisions, our laws, our ethical standards, those are entirely our own creation. Historicists love to blend these two together, blaming the arc of history for society's flaws. But Popper, he insists we absolutely cannot blame history. We, and we alone, bear sole moral responsibility for the institutions we choose to create. This brings us to our final section, Section 5, the democratic paradoxes. Let's examine these fascinating philosophical tightropes that Popper says a liberal democracy absolutely must walk if it wants to survive. And it starts by getting right to the very core of our democratic vulnerabilities. We have to ask, what actually happens if freedom is absolute and entirely unregulated?
Popper's answer to this is known as the paradox of freedom. It sounds a bit counterintuitive at first, but if you have completely unlimited freedom, the strong will inevitably use their freedom to dominate and exploit the weak. Therefore, unlimited freedom actually ends up destroying freedom altogether. Popper points out that the state actually has to step in. It must use the rule of law to limit individual freedom just enough to ensure that everyone's freedom is equally protected. And that brings us to a famously difficult dilemma, one we are still grappling with a lot today. If we want a truly tolerant society, must we tolerate absolutely everything, even intolerance?
Popper answers this with the famous paradox of tolerance. He argues that if a society is limitlessly tolerant, well, the intolerant will eventually seize control and destroy the tolerant society entirely. Now let's be clear. Popper says we should always try to counter intolerant ideas with rational public debate first. But he strongly asserts that an open society must claim the right to forcefully suppress those who refuse debate and who instead use violence and deception to destroy tolerance. It's a matter of sheer survival. Finally, we have to look at a much darker historical reality. What happens if the majority of a democratic electorate literally votes to hand over absolute power to a tyrant?
This specific threat leads Popper to address the paradox of democracy. He argues that we actually massively misunderstand the concept itself. Democracy isn't just majority rule. It's not simply doing whatever the 51% wants. At its very core, democracy is a system specifically designed with institutional mechanisms to peacefully dismiss governments, to remove bad leaders without resorting to bloodshed or civil war.
Because of this, Popper says we need to completely rethink political philosophy. We've got to stop asking the question, who should rule? Think about it. That question almost always leads to authoritarian answers like the wisest or the strongest or even the absolute majority. Instead, we need to reframe our entire focus around a totally different question. How can we so organize our political institutions that bad or incompetent rulers can be prevented from doing too much damage? It's a huge perspective shift,
It's not about finding the perfect ruler. It is ultimately all about harm reduction.
Ultimately, Popper leaves us with a realization that is incredibly hopeful, but also deeply demanding. The open society, it's not the default state of humanity. It is a fragile, ongoing experiment. There are no magical, inevitable laws of history coming to save us, and there are none coming to doom us either. The future is not predetermined. It is entirely ours to shape through the decisions we make every single day.
Please like and subscribe.